for this, what kind of rendering engine do I want to use for this particular workflow? I can say CPU product, CPU interior, GPU product, GPU interior. Again, instead of having to do this manually later, I can just select this on the fly to see if I notice a difference in the quality of my output depending on the materials that I'm using and how complex the render is. And I hit OK, and now the script is doing a whole bunch of work in the background, and you'll see that it's running, and KeyShot provides this feedback, and now it's going to start importing all the parts from the CAD file. And you'll see these part names pop up on the screen as it brings in each assembly and each part of the assembly. And now that you can see, well, we've got something going on here. We can see, in this case, it happens to be an Onyx hub. Onyx is one of my customers, and I've worked with them since the very beginning with KeyShot. And Onyx, for those of you who don't know, is a leading supplier of bike racing hubs, in particular BMX and others. And they provide the USA Olympic team with hubs. In fact, I think 7 of the 8 finalists in the Olympics this year were Onyx hub users. So it's a little shout out to my friends at Onyx. But you can see what's happening here, that the hub now is coming in, and the script is doing all the work. It's applying the label, it's positioning the label, it's applying materials not only to the exterior, but also to the interior parts of my model. And so the KeyShot scripting environment just gave me some feedback and said the script was successful, so I closed this environment. And now if I go up to my screen over here, I say, wait a second, I imported one model, but I end up with 2. How did that happen? Well, my script looked at the file and said, okay, I've got 2 different versions of this particular CAD model that I need to create. And so I'm going to just show you one of them. And in this particular case, I've actually got 2 different versions of this model. And you see, if I select both models at the same time, they interfere with each other. So I'll just select one. But the one thing I want you guys to see is that you notice that the model now came in named. So this now says, there's a part number, and it's got a bunch of nomenclature here that was not in the original CAD model. So my scripting actually named the model, okay? And so this you normally have to do by hand unless you're using scripting, right? And so again, if you're working on lots of different products, this is a big deal for saving time. And so when I look at this particular model set now, I can look at the detail inside of it. If you guys can see that I'm looking up under the scene tree, and I can, in this particular case, I have in my script, I got lazy in my script and said, don't hide this particular piece. I just hid this particular piece, which now shows the hub properly. And so I can move this around, and show you different pieces. But the other thing that's really important is that not only is this model, all the different materials have been shown on this model, I can drill into this now and select the hub. And you can see I've actually created this hub with multi-material. So I can start showing you all the different versions of all the different materials that have been applied to the shell of this hub using multi-materials. And so again, the scripting environment allows you to apply multi-materials, multiple colors and so forth. And then via scripting, you can tell the system to render the various versions all in your scripting, okay? So I have different scripts that will send various versions of the hub or various parts of the hub to the rendering system. And in this particular case, we've got 25 different materials just for one part. And so the combination of materials and so forth gets excessive very quickly. And you
Right.
can end up with thousands and thousands of images. And so if you're not using scripting, it's really just kind of impractical to do it this way unless just got a huge team of people to do this kind of work. You were going to say something, Don, was I?
Yeah, I'm curious because I realize that, material names, part names are a big deal. And you mentioned here, you've changed the name. Did you do that in order to help with the automation of applying those multi-materials?
Well, that's a great question because you'll notice that in the scene tree here, these names are untouched. These are the names that come in from the engineers of the CAD system, right?
Yeah.
And so, but those naming conventions are not very user friendly for images that may end up on an e-commerce site. And so, what we end up having to do is create images with the proper names. And when you're applying materials, if you've used material templates before, uh, KeyShot does have basically a wildcard system that allows you to search for various parts using a simple,
Asterisk.
a simple wildcard. However, if you've got a complex assembly where a lot of the terms are shared across different parts that may ultimately use different materials, then you're going to end up selecting things that you don't want for your templating environment. So I, I, because I'm, a pretty intense user of KeyShot and do all the scripting, I don't use templates very much because I have more granular control over what gets material and what doesn't get material. Okay, so you'll notice here I've got I've got bearings, I've got various pieces in assemblies that I can turn on and off. You can see even the bolts, everything has its own material because not only in this particular case do we render the finished product for Onyx Racing products, but we also render all of the spare parts. And so on the website for Onyx, let me just show you again, just to provide context. Here's the Onyx website. If I go into the website and select one of these hubs that I just rendered, in fact, I can just bring up this little guy here just to show you kind of what the output is. You can see that the output here, this is an old logo, by the way. This is something that has been since updated, so I might want to change that for the video. But you can see that I can switch the colors here, and all the renderings that I did in KeyShot are, come up obviously. And so there's a
Yeah.
combination. Just this combination alone is 25 times 11, like over 250 combinations of colors just for this. But then
It adds
I
up
also,
fast.
pardon?
It adds up fast, all those
It adds
color
up fast.
combinations.
And if you want realistic looking, renders, this is what
Yeah.
you need to do. I mean, this is the most photorealistic way to present a product. And under the parts and kits, and I mentioned that all the parts that go inside of this particular hub are also rendered. And even the spare parts that are available in separate colors are rendered. So every spare part is rendered in its own color. And
Wow.
this is all done in KeyShot.
Yeah. It's a
And
lot of
again,
production.
a lot of production and a lot of naming and so forth. And the other thing you mentioned about, why do you care about naming and controlling that is that, for an e-commerce workflow end to end, not just to put pretty pictures on a website, but actually to create an enterprise system for a big company that, is using an ERP system, all of the part numbers have to be handled properly so that you can create an end-to-end workflow from KeyShot all the way to your e-commerce system and then back into an ERP system, all without having to do any manual work. So the ERP system could pick up all the part numbers that are represented by these individual parts.
Gotcha.
And you
And
notice,
so,
and also
uh,
just again, to get back at the naming convention, you notice these names are much more user-friendly and complete. I do that all in scripting, all in
Okay.
Python scripting. Okay.
How do you locate the parts to rename? I mean, because you can have, hundreds of parts in there.
Yeah.
Is there a quick way to do that?
Well, again, it's all based on logic, right? So you have to use templates of your own, if you will. I'll use, for example, a spreadsheet that keeps track of the various categories of classes of parts that I have, right? So again, you can leave this to your imagination, but if I have parts, like I use the term widgets, well, the widgets are various different parts that happen to be in a certain category that change color. So if I'm working on a complex machine or product where a bunch of parts will share a material, I will use Python to classify those parts. I will assign a separate name for them that is not KeyShot specific. It's done strictly in the Python environment. So I can assign materials via my scripting environment, and KeyShot doesn't care. But that's the extra power that Python gives you that you're not going to see as part of a UI or a GUI within KeyShot, because it's very use case and workflow dependent. And again, if you've got a one-off project where for one marketing piece, it's not going to be worth going all through that all the scripting. But if you've got a bunch of products for a customer or for an in-house project where you've got hundreds of products or thousands of products, you have no choice but to automate if you want to get it done in a reasonable period of time. The other thing that scripting gives you is consistency and uniformity. So the great thing is you'll see your mistakes that you make on everything, and you can fix all your mistakes on everything. You don't have to go back and try to find one thing, because you could, it might be one part that was mislabeled or misclassified that you may need to revisit. And the same with all your materials and so forth. You can programmatically actually control the materials, the makeup of the materials. The other thing I wanted to mention for people that use the graph, the material graph, let's just bring up, let's bring back this hub shell, and I'll bring back material. And you can see in a material graph in the scripting environment can get pretty gnarly. So I've got, with the multi-materials, you've got all these different materials being used, right?
Yep.
And I have to say that when I first started using KeyShot, I didn't understand this material graph thing. It was like so foreign to me. However, because I learned Python, all this really represents, the material graph just represents Python functions that are tied together. So these are basically Python functions that are embedded within KeyShot that have arguments. All these little guys are arguments for functions within KeyShot. And so when Don mentioned earlier all the things about arguments for keyshots and using lists versus text strings or dictionaries and that sort of thing, KeyShot functions in the scripting environment specify typically the inputs for the arguments, and sometimes the documentation may or may not be clear on what those argument types should be. But types are data types in the programming world. Types are various types of objects, and so you could have an integer object that may represent a whole number, or you have a
float
number that represents something with decimals of digits, or a list, which is an array of items, which could be an array of text or strings, or an array of integers and strings mixed together within a list, and so forth. And again, you can go down the rabbit hole on a technical discussion on all of that, But as you get more and more familiar with Python, and as you work with KeyShot on a particular use case, you will see that the two worlds really behind the scenes or under the covers come together. And the concepts, learning to script in KeyShot and learning to code in Python are complementary skills. And so you'll understand what's going on in the material graph more by learning how to do your KeyShot scripting. And then once you get advanced enough, you can actually control the settings in the material graph all programmatically. And so I have scripts that I use for, imagine every time the geometry changes, I showed you that list of all the different STP files. Well, the geometry changes for every one of those files for where my labels have to be positioned. And so I have scripts that actually position the labels programmatically, because otherwise I'd have to eyeball it each time for something in the environment. And that's just, I don't have the patience to do that. And so I do that with automation. Okay, Don, perfect. I'm going to take my glasses off. So hopefully you don't have anything that requires me to look too close at the screen.
No, you're all good. And thank you for sharing this. There's so much here. I have a lot of questions and don't really know where to start. So I'm going to take a look at the list of questions that I had set up here and see if there's any that really resonate with the subjects that we've gone over thus far. In particular, the material graph. I'm glad that you brought that up and showed how it relates to KeyShot. In particular, there was one thing that you helped me out with a couple months ago, and that was on duplicating or copying a material in the scene. And the fix was to use a multi-material to create that duplicate, and none of this is really documented anywhere. So I was wondering if you might be able to give us a little backstory on that. Tell us how maybe you found that out or discovered it, or if there's anything you can share in particular.
Let me just say this, and I say this with all due respect to the folks at Luxion and now renamed KeyShot and the original founders and so forth. KeyShot wasn't developed or targeted at people that do work like I do every day. I mean, it's targeted at, people with fantastic talent as graphic artists and computer 3D artists and people with a lot more skill than I'll ever have in that domain. I attack this from an automation perspective, and I work with people like you, Don, and other, computer artists to create the materials and get the right lighting and so forth. But once, the combination of someone like me working with, and I'm not just saying this me as, to self-promote, but someone who has Python and KeyShot scripting skills, if you couple them up with someone who's really good on the artistry side, you've got the best of both worlds possible there for KeyShot. And to get back to your original question about, determining, how you can duplicate, say, multi-materials or materials in general programmatically, the KeyShot scripting environment documentation is kind of a minimalist set of documentation required to get eager beavers like me going. But you really do have to spend a lot of time, learning all of the ins and outs of Python and KeyShot scripting, documented and undocumented, to get to an advanced level. It doesn't mean you can't use it to do a lot of productive work just as it is. But if you want to get into more advanced topics, like anything, you're going to have to go around the edges a bit. And this isn't just true of KeyShot and their Python environment, but all software is kind of a living, breathing thing, and it's constantly changing. And I mean, everyone sees updates to their software environments, no matter who's providing it these days. on a constant basis because people are discovering bugs and things that are missing and so forth. So that's just it doesn't just apply to KeyShot. So to answer your question about the material graph and duplicating it, I was trying to duplicate something, a material graph, and I couldn't figure out how to do it, by reading the documentation. So I just started experimenting. And this is another kind of key concept in programming that I learned basically from a guy who was a genius in college, who ended up, I think he scored like in the top 5% of the country on the law school exam test, and he took it just for kicks. He never became a lawyer. He was a bona fide genius. He ended up doing work in mathematics, but he once was playing with the keyboard on the computer. This is many years ago, and he took out his hands and he just started, typing everything possible to screw up or to find something that might work. And I said, "What are you doing? You're typing all this stuff. Aren't you going to hurt something on the keyboard?" And that mentality kind of that he had really stuck with me. It's like, you can't really hurt anything unless you have access, to the Pentagon nuclear codes or something. You can't really hurt anything if you start experimenting with the KeyShot, scripting environment. So if something isn't clear to you in the documentation, just try it and say, well, maybe this will work. And that's how you'll discover something that may not be documented. And that's how I discovered that little trick that I shared with you, is that something that didn't quite make sense to me, I tried it anyway, and I said, oh, that's how you do it. And it worked.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, there it is, right? Well, I have to thank you for sharing that tip with me, because I tried figuring that one out for months, if not a year, pretty much trying to nail that one down. But as soon as I did, pretty much everything changed as far as scripting for the material graph. And have you noticed any hidden nodes inside the material graph that we can only bring up through scripting?
Well, yes, but I think that's a topic for another day. Only because if you're getting into really advanced scripting, you will find the notion of working with objects, and conceptually Python works with objects, and sometimes you can discover via using various methods of a class. And in Python, you have this concept of classes, which are really basically blueprints for creating objects in Python, the things that you work with every day. And a Python class has methods, which are merely functions for a class. And within those methods, there are things like getting children for an object. And sometimes the objects that are retrieved are objects programmatically or retrieved that you cannot see in your scene tree. And so it can be a little bit confusing if you don't handle that properly. And I'd be happy to talk to someone offline about that if they are dealing with that. But there are tricks that you have to be aware of when you're trying to do virtually everything in scripting, like I do, where I'm actually creating entire bills of materials for products. I'm configuring products, where I start with one STP file and I may end up with 10 different configured products, each with various combinations of objects that have to be turned on and off. And some of those objects are partial assemblies of CAD files, which need to be turned off in various unique combinations. And so it gets a little bit more involved. And you also run into issues in KeyShot scripting environments where you're working with multiple surfaces. For the artists out there that do a lot of different work on surfaces, you can have an object in KeyShot that is in your scene, and if it's got multiple surfaces of the same object, the names are identical. So programmatically, how do you determine what surface is that what, which surface you want to work on. And sometimes you have to use geometric, some of the Lux math capabilities to differentiate various surfaces by dimensions or lengths or widths or whatever, so that you can consistently apply materials to that type of object programmatically.
Yeah, that's one of the tough things that I had to learn and understand, and it still trips me up every now and then when we're working with those objects, because they can have node IDs, they can have node names, certain ways that they're structured inside of the scene tree, whether it's a group, a model, or a part, can all have different options. Or perhaps you want to animate something and it will tell you, well, you can't animate that, you can only animate that if it's in a group. So there's a lot of things that can make it difficult. As you were mentioning, how do you know that all those surfaces, which one's which, if they're all named the same, right?
Correct.
And I think that that's going into those node IDs. And even in the material graph, when working with the material IDs, a lot of times when we create those brand new nodes, they don't have a name at all. If you go in and you just create a 2D mapping node, there's no name for that.
Right.
And if you want to programmatically create a material graph, you need to be able to not only know the node name, but also the node IDs, because you're going to want to go back and verify that all your connections work. So, I'm just kind of expanding upon what you were discussing earlier. There's a lot of these hidden ways of gathering information inside of KeyShot. In fact, I think my information folder is probably larger than any of my other scripting folders, because there's so much information that we need to grab in order to just apply a material to a part that has the same name of another part, let's say. So yeah, just wanted to put my 2 cents in there as well. These are really great points that you're bringing up and sharing with us here. Currently, is there anything that you, let's say you're like me, for example, and you don't know very much. Are there any like questions that you still have, or how comfortable do you feel like when you have a new process that you're trying to build? Is it more of a, trial and error thing, or can you just sit down and say, oh, okay, I know what kind of process this needs to follow, and here's what I need to do?
Well, that's a little unfair question for somebody who's been doing this since 2017, because what I know now and what I knew when I started out are obviously very different. The thing I would say is that the, getting really proficient at KeyShot scripting, or developing programs in general, requires a commitment. It's not. It's kind of like playing the piano, or unless you're just supernaturally gifted at it, you have to practice. It's like learning an instrument. But having said that, I think it's important that KeyShot users know that everything in the Python GUI interface, and the one that most of you work with every day, all of the buttons and the settings and configurations and so forth that are available in the GUI are not available in the KeyShot scripting environment, whether it's the headless environment or the regular KeyShot scripting environment. And so you can't automate everything that you do in the KeyShot GUI with the KeyShot scripting environment. Now, KeyShot, as a company, over time has been adding more and more functionality from the GUI to the scripting environment. And so I imagine it's an economics question and a demand question that, over time, if enough people say, hey, I want to be able to do X, Y, or Z in the scripting environment, and I don't see a function available, then just, use the forums and other feedback mechanisms that you have at your disposal to let the KeyShot people know. Because I know that the developers have so much to do all the time, just trying to keep up with, all the new features and all the new technologies and all the new, CPUs and GPUs and so forth. It's an enormous effort to build a product as complex as KeyShot. And it's a phenomenal product and a phenomenal application environment. I mean, you can look at programs like Blender and others, but they require an even greater commitment, and you tend to get even more specialized when you start using tools like Blender. What I mean by that is that you need to become an expert in just one slice of Blender to become really proficient at it. Now, obviously, there are exceptions to that, and there's some Blender gurus out there. So no disrespect to them, but for average, or above average, people in this industry, KeyShot is a phenomenally productive tool to help you create, either through the GUI or with the help of scripts, phenomenally photorealistic, beautiful imagery for marketing and e-commerce, work and so forth. And again, I am promoting KeyShot because I do believe in the product. I wouldn't be on this video if I didn't think it was a good product. And so I've invested a lot of time and effort into it because I had the good fortune of knowing the original founders, and now the KeyShot has even more resources behind it. I know that the application has a pretty good chance of only getting better, and the environment for scripting and automation will only get better. So what else do I need to say? There was another thing I wanted to mention to you since we talked about AI, because we're all inundated with AI hype. And I think some of it's starting to die down a little bit now, and people are realizing that it's not going to take over everything that we do yet. It has a long way to go, but the KeyShot scripting environment and the work that Don has done using ChatGPT are illustrative of the limitations and the potential for tools like ChatGPT. The more you know about Python scripting and KeyShot scripting, the more useful these tools like ChatGPT are. But if you're brand new to KeyShot scripting, you can use ChatGPT to help you learn Python, and it's a wonderful tool for that. But it will, because it's exposed to very little training data on KeyShot scripting itself, and the secret sauce on all these large language models and AI models like ChatGPT and Claude and others, is that these companies are spending hundreds of millions of dollars, training their AI models on data that's publicly available, right? Well, KeyShot scripts are not, first of all, there's not that many of them, and two, it's not enough data to train these models to make them like perfect. So bear that in mind when you use these tools like ChatGPT or Claude or whatever, that they're great at helping you learn general concepts in Python and even in KeyShot, as Don has demonstrated, but they can easily lead you down a rabbit hole. So you do have to use your noggin. You can't just stop thinking. You got to use that too.
Yeah, definitely. And, shameless self-plug here, as you're mentioning, curating that knowledge is really important. And that's, what I've done with a custom GPT, the KeyShot Python scripting assistant, is basically curate all of that knowledge, ensure that the AI is absolutely using that knowledge as opposed to external libraries. And that was some of the things that I had to overcome when creating the GPT, because I didn't know that there are particular constraints, right? And so, as you were mentioning, I'm learning about Python, I'm learning about AI, and I'm learning about, the KeyShot Python API all at once. And so, yeah, ChatGPT has been a great teacher. And I've only been doing this for like 2 years, and still I'm not proficient in writing it, but I feel comfortable reading it and seeing why possibly something doesn't break. And I will say I do feel very confident in understanding the KeyShot library and all of the types, functions, constraints, constants, and classes, and so on within there. But using the GPT that I had created, you're going to get something a little bit different there when compared to just the regular default chat GPT. And to your point as well, there's only a handful of scripts included inside of KeyShot when we ship it, but the Python assistant that I've got out there, I'm continually updating. It has over 100 scripting examples in there. You just have to ask for them. Right. So the AI will actually pull from that knowledge. It's been given those specific
Well,
instructions to do so. So
I think it's good that you mentioned your background and experience, Don. I mean, the one thing you have is enthusiasm and curiosity. Those are two ingredients necessary to learn anything. And your work with Chat GPT has been impressive because you've been able to create very useful scripts by committing some time to learning it, obviously, and playing with it, which is what people need to do. And I would encourage users out there to look at Don's Chat GPT. They're not 100% Chat GPT because Don has to fix them, but the combination of somebody who's enthusiastic and determined to make something work, and a tool like ChatGPT, you can help you create some very useful scripts that you can put to work right away. So
yeah, and I think for a lot of users that are just getting started, it's good for a little bit of instant gratification. Perhaps you're just wanting to learn how to create a camera. When the first script I did was I wanted to automate the camera creation process. Sure, I could import the file, but what if I didn't have that file, but I had a script and I could just run that script every time, right?
right.
And so that was like the first thing I made with ChatGPT, and it took a long time, and it was very exciting to start out with these small scripts. So I've really ended up using that a lot and think about building modules and smaller scripts, and then going back to ChatGPT and saying, all right, I've got all these scripts, let's extend those. But there really is a lot of even coding terminology that I had to revisit, and some things I didn't know at all. And ChatGPT has been able to help me with that. So taking that feedback from ChatGPT and seeing where your mistakes are, you can always go back and then use that prompt that ChatGPT said. For example, um, let's say you were trying to extend a script, only you say, I want to update this script. ChatGPT is going to look at it and say, oh, update. I'm going to rewrite the whole thing. Whereas if you extend the script for added functionality and tell ChatGPT to extend the script with added functionality, it's not going to rewrite everything. It's just going to add the functionality there while not changing everything. And so that's where I see a lot of terminology that I have to learn. And fortunately, we can kind of get that from working with the GPT and the way that it responds to us. So, yeah, just I didn't want to derail that there. I think it's pretty cool that you're bringing up the AI because I do think that a lot of new users, new people new to code, and a lot of our customer bases comprised of industrial designers, and not to say that they don't know Python, but it can be intimidating for a lot of guys to or a lot of
Well,
users to.
it's another tool in the tool chest, and for those of you who like to work on projects around your house, you know that yes, you've got the tools in the garage, but it doesn't necessarily mean you know how to use them that well. So it takes practice. It takes practice. But for learning, the new AI tools like ChatGPT are amazing because you can take a topic that you have no knowledge of whatsoever, and it can give you some really good directional hints to dig deeper and explore and learn, and point you to resources that that are going to be helpful for you to learn things. So that's where there's a very strong value proposition using tools like that. I mean, I use ChatGPT and its competitors all the time, but I've also learned what the limitations are, and so it's just another tool in your toolbox. And
Uh,
you know, unless you really want to, become an expert at it, you don't have to, go down the rabbit hole like I have in so many cases. But this is a passion of mine, and I love automation, and I love making workflows easier to do and more repetitive and repeatable, so that the artists can focus on making things look better, and I can focus on getting the production out, which is what most of us need when we're working inside of a company or in a commercial environment. We've got to be productive. So the combination is pretty powerful.
Yeah, and you kind of brought me back to the very first time I saw the power of scripting within 3D. And so a long time ago, in the days before KeyShot, it used to take 2 weeks just to import a CAD assembly from Pro E, and that
Yes.
was because we had so many issues. We were pretty much importing each part of the assembly one at a time, and
Right.
these were all IGES files, and we had to import them one at a time because every so often you'd get a bad part, right? And
Right.
so you'd want to have that visual there. And it was taking 40 hours just to import the model and 80 hours just to build it all out, right? Because you're
Right.
organizing everything and whatnot. So everybody was tired of that. And so my former mentor, brilliant, brilliant man, he created a script inside of Maya. Maya is built on its own scripting, which is Maya embedded language known as MEL. It's very
Right.
similar to Python. So much so that you can just script in Python inside of Maya. But he created a script that would go out to directories and just do a batch import, much like the one
Yeah.
that you were showing earlier, and some that I myself have created. But that's where he ended up that cut off 40 hours.
Right.
We were saving so much time there. And then through the years of utilizing Photoshop actions, trying to build that perfect action to save out all of your layers or all your colorways, naming them appropriately, and so on. So, I'd always wanted to get there and be able to create those scripts and automate stuff, because I was one of those users that had to create hundreds of images every week, and we would have thousands of SKUs to kick out. So having some kind of automation there, like you were saying,
Absolutely.
I enjoy it. I like to
I
find
just
the fastest way to get something done, right?
I just want to. Was working on. Excuse me. I was just working on a project where I was doing post processing action automation in Photoshop, and then I said to myself, "Wait a second! I can do this work that I'm doing in Photoshop in KeyShot." And it was just a fairly simple modification to a script, and I was able to avoid using Photoshop altogether for some of the post processing work that I was considering doing. It was like simple image resizing and compositing of images, which I do a lot of. When you want to create really high fidelity images, you're taking PNGs and layering them. And so yeah, there's the I guess when you were talking there, Don, I was thinking about, again, the value of learning Python well extends to learning or utilizing tools and other, post-processing tools in your workflow that are not KeyShot. It just helps you all the way around in reducing time of your workflows. And so you can focus on the more creative side of your work instead of just the boring repetition part of your work.
Right. Yeah, and it's funny you bring that up, because I'll tell people a lot of times my favorite thing to do is light inside a KeyShot, and that's typically what I have the least amount of time to do, because there's all this other process involved, and things that we've got to get done that take more of our time, whether it's something that we've got a repetitive task that we can just trade it up and use Python, and then focus on the fun things like lighting or creating materials, which are two of the things that I enjoy more so than going through and restructuring the CAD and making sure that all my groups are set and things are named accordingly, right? And you also mentioned the benefit of knowing Python, and just to kind of go, speak to that a little bit more, is I've had to use a lot of what I know when creating the GPTs, because they're all created with Python essentially. And so, you can have it find those particular knowledge files, let's say locate a particular class inside
Mhm.
of the Lux library, and to do it in a way that is consistent, so it always looks at that particular information instead of assuming it already knows something. You can use Python code there and say, hey, when this topic comes up, then we'll need you to go out here, look at this file or preload it.
Right.
And, it's all based on Python. So it was really a great way to transition over and start using Python outside of KeyShot. I didn't think I'd have a use for it. In all honesty, I didn't think I'd have much of a use since I don't do production anymore. Why would I want to make all these scripts? And, one of them is because, like I said, I do enjoy the idea of building a fast and efficient pipeline and workflows. And then, the other part of it is just because I enjoy it
Yeah.
even more so, and I want to help our customers mainly. When somebody asks, hey, can we do this, then yeah, I want to say we can. And then it's also for training as well. We've had more of those training sessions come up in the past year, and I really feel like a lot of our users would benefit from at least experimenting, like what you were saying, getting in there and playing with it. And it can be hard, but you've got to want it as well, right? And I know that there's a lot of users like us who really enjoy the process side of things, of creating those efficient workflows.
Yep.
It's very cool.
Very true.
So looking at my list here, what would you say are some of the common pitfalls or, errors that you've seen? I gave the example previously about the name types. Let me see if I can quote that.
Yeah.
The strings
Go
and
ahead.
and all of that, it still trips me up, having to put in the parentheses. And I think a lot of Python users may have that common error come up as well. So are there anything else that you can prepare us for, us
Well,
being
I
the
want to
other
make a
users?
let me make a general statement about coming at approaching programming in general. If you haven't been professionally trained in it, uh, in high school or college or whatever, um, the thing about programming that is helpful to get into your head is that you have to start thinking about breaking things into atomic parts, because computers are not that smart. They're not smart at all, right? It's just the way we tell them to act that's pretty clever. That's still the humans still have the upper hand there. And when you get into using functions and classes and methods and get into all this jargon, right? The
Yeah.
purpose of that is to break things into smaller chunks. And so things that we intuitively, infer or uh, not only infer, but what's the right word that infer from the project or the problem that we're looking at. We make so many assumptions in our brain about what takes place to go, well, why can't you just drag this thing from here over to here? Well, in the computer world, it's a ginormous task. But in the human mind, it's like very simple. You just grab it here and you just move it over there. And the computer programming languages have to break that seemingly simple task into something, into hundreds, if not thousands, of little tiny steps. And so in the background, once you get your head around that, it makes it easier for you to understand why some of these things have to be broken into all these different steps, and they're not so intimidating. You say, okay, I got to do this, I got to do that, I got to do this, I got to do that. And then once you start thinking that way, it becomes easier to grasp all the concepts as you learn.
Yeah,
And
it's like creating actions in Photoshop. It seems like it'd be so easy to just sit here, oh yeah, I can just go and run through this, and then you realize, oh, I need to take this step this way, and you know, an
exactly,
action you thought you were going to make in 2 minutes ends up taking you 30 minutes
exactly,
because you didn't think of all of these things that can happen. And I feel like, you know, creating these scripts and KeyShot is much like the same thing. I'll either possibly get a customer request. Maybe they want to see if something's possible and they give me the workflow on it, and you take a look at it, try to follow that workflow, and then you realize, no, this isn't how to do it. We've got to take this particular approach because we've got this constraint inside a KeyShot. So then you're reworking through that process to find, you know, the other way for it to work, or
exactly.
the same outcome, just a different way of doing it. And that can take a long time. I used to have a lot more fun in the beginning, but lately it feels like I've really had to work hard with the AI in order to get the scripts to work. So it becomes less fun, but the challenge, and when you are able to overcome the challenge, it feels a lot more exciting than the instant gratification, because you've gone through that blood, sweat, and tears of, you know, making sure the script works, and you got the AI there, you know, making sure that that works as well, because, you know, like it says at the bottom, ChatGPT can make mistakes, and to
Yeah,
always check your important information there, right?
right.
Um, so,
But
you know,
the other thing I wanted to the other thing I wanted to mention, because you were talking about the gotchas a little bit, Don, you asked me to comment on that. A gotcha that will get someone like me, because I'm by nature a very curious person. Um, but if you're learning KeyShot again, and you're working for a company and you're in a commercial environment, you've got to ask the why question. So, you know, why do you want to automate this? And if the project isn't large enough, or you know there isn't enough to gain by automating, even if you can, don't automate it. You know, do what you're doing manually. It's very easy to go down the path of, you know, automating things that you don't need to automate. So, you know, automation is great when it's useful and there's a, you know, a value proposition. But, you know, don't just automate other than for the sake of learning. I mean, learning is a different story. You want to automate for the sake of learning, but for, you know, for payback, where, you know, your team, or, you know, your boss, or whatever your organizational structure is, asks you, well, why are you working on it? What's taking you so long? And you say, well, I'm working on a script. And so, well, what is that going to give you, right? What
yeah.
is that going to save you? If you can't answer that question very well, you know, they're not going to be happy. So, you know, if you could say, well, I think I can cut the lead time or the production time for this project that's going to, you know, that's been scheduled for 3 months, I think I can, you know, shave off 2 weeks or a month because
Yeah.
of this automation. I need to invest X so I can get this return later, right? So don't forget about that. That's my, you know, my entrepreneurial head, you know, raising up and saying, hey, you know, just don't talk tech here, because automation is great if it's useful. All of this stuff is great if it's useful. Just don't forget that when you're, you know, trying to justify the time that you're going to spend on a particular project or work.